Right, so the International Court of Justice ruling yesterday elicited what can only be described as a, well, completely insane reaction on the part of Israel, really. And if you only heard Netanyahu's reaction, then you've not heard the worst of it. Whilst many commentators have looked at the orders and tried to work out whether a ceasefire was called or wasn't called, newsflash, not in so many words, but to all intents and purposes, yes, it pretty much was called, as I covered yesterday. And that really ought to be borne out by the dismissal of the ruling already. The accusations of antisemitism towards the ICJ, which were so obviously going to come, you could have set your watch by them. Not to mention outright dismissal, even trying to sell the ICJ verdict as a win for Israel, which it blatantly was not. Israel remain utterly incorrigible. Those supporting them still are left with a headache over it. No sympathy here for you. And in all likelihood, when the ICJ expects its report from Israel on how it has met these legally binding orders they have set down in 1 month's time, with this attitude, well, they're probably going to be looking at a blank sheet of paper, aren't they? So what are they going to do then? Right, so Israel's response to having lost so heavily at the ICJ to South Africa, prima facie level anyway, at first glance, has veered from angry outbursts to ardent dismissal to even trying to sell it as a win for themselves instead. The one thing no Israeli official has done that I've seen is just accept the verdict and act on it, though. It's not like the ICJ have demanded anything that cannot be seen as basic reasonable actions, though, but even they are more than many people expected. Mitigate the killing of civilians, protect them even. Therefore, a ceasefire in practice has actually been ordered. Since Israel cannot continue its indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza and its sniping of people waving white flags, it's been ordered to change its ways, change its tactics. But because they claim they cannot pick Hamas out from civilians, the order effectively demands Israel end what they're doing in accordance with what they themselves have said. It's all rather clever. But then, of course, aid must be allowed in, and basic services and infrastructure that Israel have destroyed must be restored by them as well. They destroyed it, they should fix it. Oh, and report back to the ICJ in 1 month to show what you've done. We want to see your homework. You'd think the ICJ had ordered them to peel their own eyeballs listening to some of them, though. Let's start with Netanyahu and what he said, because this is a guy whose only chance of staying out of jail pretty much depends on staying in power, and that depends on keeping these atrocities going, to his mind. So he can't afford to stop now as a result. The ICJ ruling is causing him big problems personally, so naturally he's going to push back. He said, Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide levelled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous, and decent people everywhere should reject it. On the eve of the Holocaust Remembrance Day, I again pledge as Israel's Prime Minister, never again. Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas, a genocidal terror organisation. On October 7th, Hamas perpetrated the most horrific atrocities against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and it vows to repeat these atrocities again and again and again. Our war is against Hamas terrorists, not against Palestinian civilians. We will continue to facilitate humanitarian assistance and to do our utmost to keep civilians out of harm's way, even as Hamas uses civilians as human shields. We will continue to do what is necessary to defend our country and defend our people. Yes, he gave that broadcast yesterday because today, as this video goes out, 27th of January, is Holocaust Remembrance Day, as the world collectively vows to remember the Holocaust and say, never again. But it's literally happening in front of our eyes, and the International Court of Justice says there is a case to investigate. So never again, coming from you, BB, is what is actually outrageous, not the verdict they handed down at this early stage. The terms of prima facie have been met under the Genocide Convention, so genocide accusations are entirely appropriate right now. The deaths caused on October 7th must be investigated too, since so many of the deaths have, as eyewitnesses have attested to, been by Israeli hands and not by Hamas hands. Hamas issued a grossly underreported statement, which I covered the other day, saying their intent on October 7th was to secure military hostages for hostage exchanges. Because for all of Netanyahu's claims of not having issues with Palestinian civilians, many more are locked up in Israeli jails than Hamas hold Israelis. Hostage exchanges have gone on for decades. It is the reason Israel have the existence of these Hannibal directives. because that is to negate these exchanges by the Israeli forces. It is Israeli forces killing their own people before they can be taken hostage. It is barbaric. It was supposedly stopped in 2016, yet witness after witness still bring them up as active orders being carried out to this day. Israeli witnesses. Your commitment to international law isn't unwavering, it's non-existent in light of this response to that ICJ ruling. But his response was actually the even-handed one. His security minister, let's turn to him, the hard-right and completely off his gourd, Itamar Ben-Gvir, a guy who is in government because, well, Netanyahu gave him his own police force in effect to oversee, because that's not at all too creepy, is it? But it put Bibi back in power, which is all that really mattered, and he responded to the ICJ verdict by tweeting out, "Haig Schmeig." Sure, that's unwavering support for international law, isn't it? Ben-Gvir went further, though. The Times of Israel reported him as having said, "The decision of the anti-Semitic court in The Hague proves what was already known. This court does not seek justice, but rather the persecution of Jewish people. They were silent during the Holocaust, and today they continue the hypocrisy and take it another step further. Decisions that endanger the continued existence of the State of Israel must not be listened to. We must continue defeating the enemy until complete victory." Holocaust Remembrance Day. Remember, that's today. We remember the Holocaust, which was conducted between 1941 and 1945. And if Ben-Gvir, to get over his rabid responses and engage his brain for 2 seconds, was capable of any such thing, the fact he's attacked the ICJ for having been silent during the Holocaust might have a lot to do with the fact they didn't exist at that point. They weren't founded until 1945, at the end of it, and they didn't actually begin work as the rest of the United Nations were still being set up until April of 1946. The Holocaust was over. The ICJ was literally founded off the back of that atrocity, which should never be forgotten, which should be a never again moment. But sadly is very much appearing to not be the case, and we have to call that out as we bear witness to it now. Oh, and of course he played the anti-Semitism card, didn't he? Because someone was bound to, weren't they? Ben-Gvir, for all of his faux outrage here, was literally calling for a voluntary migration plan for all Palestinians in Gaza as recently as the 19th of this month. That's ethnic cleansing. That's a war crime. That's a human rights violation. That is not leaving Palestinian civilians alone, as Netanyahu claimed last night. But contrary to both their opinions has been the besuited smarmy opinion sought by the mainstream media of a guy who appears to be the new Israeli apologist of choice for the mainstream media, Elon Levy, an Israeli government spokesperson. He went on to Murdoch Radio, Times Radio, speaking to Aisha Hazarika, and said, "This was a sick stunt, unfortunately, by South Africa, to try to take the victims of genocide and cast that allegation against them. South Africa brought a case against Israel seeking to force it to suspend its military action against Hamas and abandon the hostages while leaving Hamas free to re-offend, and the court was wise to throw that out and reaffirmed that Israel has an inherent and natural right to defend its people and bring back the hostages, who, by the way, the court called for their immediate and unconditional release." Thing is, the case wasn't thrown out. There's merit to it, and they're going to carry this case forward. Prima facie was proven. To all intents and purposes, the order put upon Israel do call for a ceasefire, because it is impossible for them to carry on as they have been with the level of civilian deaths, which are grossly excessive. As for self-defence, Israel's been razing Gaza to the ground for 3 months, off the back of one incursion on one night by Hamas to grab hostages. And I'll admit, that is their version of events and absolutely should be investigated too. But your self-defence argument is out of the window, especially when you consider, it should not be forgotten, that this is 56-year-long occupied territory, occupied people who in Gaza specifically have been under blockade as well since 2007. Your self-defence is against a captive population who you yourselves are holding captive. They have an entitlement under international law to resist that. So regardless of what you think of Hamas or anyone else in the Gaza Strip and what they themselves have done and do and will continue to do, that's a basic tenet that underlies everything and must always be taken into consideration. So we have the Israeli PM, a government spokesperson, and the security minister of Israel, all taking different views on the ICJ verdict, from dismissal to insult to varying views even on what the ruling yesterday meant. Israel is in disarray behind the scenes based on this. But the one thing I think they all agree on is that this won't stop. They will just carry on, and some form of escalation of sanctions further down the line by the ICJ, as Israel certainly will violate these orders given, seem likely. Enforcing them, however, may be another matter. It's not for the court to do that, it's for the Security Council. The US have their pesky veto, though it's going to be a lot worse a look on them if they choose to exercise it following these rulings by the ICJ. And whilst Hamas are not on trial here, another factor Israel seemed to keep missing, by the way, the media missed the fact that Hamas had issued their own statement based on the night of October 7th, which if you want to know what their opinion actually is, since nobody seems interested in asking 3 months on, well, I've covered it here. You should probably watch it next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.